March 1863, Tullahoma, Tennessee, late at night. Confederate General Braxton Bragg lay sleeping in his headquarters. Outside, his army was in winter quarters. Inside, all was quiet. Beneath his bed, hidden in the darkness, was a 12-pound artillery shell fitted with a fuse, set to explode. Someone had placed it there, someone who wanted Braxton Bragg dead, not a Union spy, not an assassin from the North. One of his own soldiers. The shell was designed to blow Bragg apart in his sleep, to solve in one violent moment what thousands of Confederate soldiers saw as their army's greatest problem. The next morning, a servant discovered the shell before it could detonate. Bragg was informed. He ordered an investigation, but no one was ever caught. Someone in the Army of Tennessee had tried to murder their commanding general, and they had nearly succeeded. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the Civil War, there were whispers of fragging, soldiers deliberately killing their own officers, men who believed their commanders were incompetent, cruel, or cowardly, men who decided that the greatest threat to their survival was not the enemy across the battlefield but the officer giving the orders. Some of these stories are documented, others are rumors that have persisted for over 160 years, but they all point to a dark truth about the Civil War. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy wore the same uniform. This is the story of fragging in the Civil War, the story of Braxton Bragg and the bomb under his bed, the story of deserters who swore vengeance against their commanders, and the story of how the line between duty and murder became dangerously blurred. Introduction. Welcome, friends. I am so glad you are here with me today. We like to think of the Civil War in terms of honor and courage, of men fighting bravely for their cause, of soldiers who loved their commanders and followed them into hell. But the reality was more complicated. The Civil War had the highest desertion rate of any American conflict. 1 in 5 Union soldiers deserted, 1 in 3 Confederate soldiers. That is not the behavior of men who believed in their cause or trusted their leaders. And some soldiers did more than just desert. Some turned violent, some plotted revenge against officers they blamed for their suffering. The most famous attempt was the bomb under General Braxton Bragg's bed, but there were others. Nathan Bedford Forrest was shot by one of his own lieutenants. Stonewall Jackson executed deserters so harshly that soldiers from the Shenandoah Valley swore they would kill him if they got the chance. Today, we are going to explore this dark side of the Civil War. The side where soldiers did not follow orders, where they deserted, where they plotted murder, where the greatest danger came from within. If you love these complex stories that show the Civil War as it really was, not as we wish it had been, I hope you will subscribe to our channel. Now, let us begin with the most hated general in the Confederate Army. Background: Braxton Bragg, the most hated general. To understand why someone tried to kill Braxton Bragg, you need to understand who Braxton Bragg was. He was born in North Carolina in 1817. He graduated 5th in his class from West Point in 1837. He served with distinction in the Mexican War, earning 3 brevet promotions for gallantry. He was a competent military officer, but he was also rigid, harsh, and paranoid. There is a famous story from Bragg's pre-war Army service. He was serving as both a company commander and the post quartermaster. In his role as company commander, he submitted a requisition for supplies. In his role as quartermaster, he denied his own requisition. He then wrote a letter to the post commander complaining about the quartermaster himself. The post commander supposedly replied, "My God, Mr. Bragg, you have quarreled with every officer in the army, and now you are quarreling with yourself." Bragg was a man who followed regulations to the letter and expected everyone else to do the same. He had no tolerance for human weakness, no understanding of morale, no ability to inspire loyalty. When the Civil War began, Bragg received high command because of his West Point pedigree and Mexican War record. By October of 1862, he commanded the Army of Tennessee, the Confederacy's second-largest army, and his soldiers hated him. Bragg was a harsh disciplinarian. He ordered mass executions of deserters. He court-martialed officers for minor infractions. He blamed subordinates for his own failures. After the Battle of Perryville in October 1862, Bragg retreated from Kentucky despite having tactical success. His officers were furious. They had won the battle and Bragg was running away. After the Battle of Stones River in January 1863, Bragg claimed victory and then retreated again. His generals openly criticized him. Some wrote letters to Jefferson Davis demanding Bragg's removal, but Davis kept Bragg in command, and the soldiers of the Army of Tennessee suffered under his leadership. By March of 1863, morale in the Army of Tennessee was at an all-time low. Desertions were epidemic. Officers were resigning. Soldiers were writing letters home saying they would rather be shot by the Yankees than continue serving under Bragg. And someone decided that if Jefferson Davis would not remove Bragg, they would remove him themselves. The bomb, March 1863. The details of the bombing attempt are sparse. Confederate authorities did not publicize it. Modern historians debate what exactly happened. What we know is this: in March of 1863, while the Army of Tennessee was in winter quarters at Tullahoma, Tennessee, someone placed an artillery shell beneath General Bragg's bed. The shell was fitted with a fuse. It was designed to explode while Bragg was sleeping, killing him and anyone else in the room. A servant or aide discovered the shell before it could detonate. The exact timing is unclear. Some accounts say it was discovered just before it was set to explode. Others say it was found hours earlier. Bragg ordered an investigation. Who had access to his headquarters? Who could have placed the shell? Who wanted him dead? The answer to that last question was almost everyone in the Army of Tennessee. The investigation went nowhere. No one was arrested. No one was charged. Either the investigators could not find the culprit or they chose not to look too hard. There was speculation that it was a deserter, someone who had left the army and then returned specifically to kill Bragg, someone who blamed Bragg for the deaths of friends, for the harsh discipline, for the endless retreats, or it could have been someone still in the army, an officer who had been humiliated. A soldier who had watched friends executed for desertion, someone who decided that assassination was preferable to mutiny. We will never know, but the attempt on Bragg's life sent a message. The Army of Tennessee was not a loyal force following their commander. It was a demoralized, angry mass of men who had lost faith in their leadership, and at least one of them was willing to commit murder. The phenomenon fragging. In the Civil War, the term fragging comes from the Vietnam War. It refers to soldiers using fragmentation grenades to kill their own officers. The term is modern, but the concept is ancient. In the Civil War, documented cases of fragging are rare, but they existed. Nathan Bedford Forrest. In June of 1863, Confederate General Forrest had a confrontation with Lieutenant A.W. Good. Forrest publicly humiliated Good, calling him a coward. Good challenged Forrest to a duel. Forrest refused. Days later, Good ambushed Forrest in his headquarters. He fired a pistol at point-blank range, hitting Forrest in the side. Forrest, even wounded, pulled out a pocket knife and stabbed Good. Both men survived, though Forrest's wound was serious. This was not exactly fragging. It was more like an honor dispute that turned violent. But it shows how quickly relationships between officers could deteriorate into attempted murder. Stonewall Jackson. In August of 1862, Jackson ordered the execution of 3 deserters from Shenandoah Valley regiments. The executions were brutal. The entire division was forced to watch. Historian accounts mention that after these executions, some soldiers from the Shenandoah Valley swore they would kill Jackson if they had the chance. They believed the executed men were not deserters but soldiers who had gone home briefly to help with harvests, as was common practice early in the war. Jackson was eventually killed by friendly fire at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. The official story is that Confederate pickets, in darkness and confusion, mistook Jackson's party for Union cavalry. But there have always been whispers. What if it was not a mistake? What if someone saw an opportunity? There is no evidence to support this theory, but the whispers persist because Jackson had made enemies within his own army. Colonel Dixon Miles. At the Battle of Harper's Ferry in September 1862, Union Colonel Dixon Miles surrendered his garrison to Stonewall Jackson. Many of his men were furious. They believed Miles had given up without a proper fight. There were rumors that Miles had been drinking. Shortly after announcing the surrender, Miles was struck by a Confederate artillery shell and mortally wounded. The official story is that it was an unlucky shot from the enemy, but some historians have speculated, was it really Confederate artillery, or was it one of Miles' own men using the chaos of battle to exact revenge? Again, there is no proof, but the speculation exists because soldiers were angry enough to want their commander dead. The desertion epidemic. To understand fragging, you have to understand desertion. Because the two are related, both are symptoms of a breakdown in military discipline and morale. Desertion in the Civil War was epidemic. Official Union records show over 200,000 desertions. Some estimates go as high as 280,000. Confederate records show at least 103,000 desertions, with some estimates suggesting 1 in 3 Confederate soldiers deserted at some point. Why did so many men desert? Homesickness, fear, hunger, poor leadership, harsh discipline, pointless casualties. The realization that the war was not what they thought it would be, many deserters simply walked away. They went home. They hoped they would not be caught, but some deserters were more aggressive. They formed armed bands, jayhawkers, bushwhackers. Men who had deserted both armies and now terrorized civilians and hunted conscription officers. In Louisiana, Confederate generals Kirby Smith and Richard Taylor issued orders to shoot armed deserters on sight. Confederate counterinsurgency strike teams hunted down deserter bands and executed them without trial. In North Carolina and Tennessee, deserter bands became so powerful that they controlled entire counties. They ambushed Confederate recruiting parties. They burned the homes of Confederate officials. They were no longer just deserters. They were rebels within the rebellion. And some of these deserters harbored deep hatred for the officers who had driven them to desert. Officers like Braxton Bragg. The executions, the price of desertion. For those deserters who were caught, the punishment was often death. Approximately 500 men, Union and Confederate combined, were executed during the Civil War, 2/3 of them for desertion. The executions were public, designed to terrify, to deter. A typical execution went like this. The condemned man's regiment would form 3 sides of a square. The condemned man would be marched out under guard to form the 4th side of the square while the regimental band played the Dead March. A chaplain would offer prayers. The condemned man would be blindfolded and sometimes tied to a stake. A firing squad would line up, 12 men. Sometimes 1 or 2 of them had rifles loaded with blanks so each man could tell himself that perhaps he had not been the one who killed his comrade. Ready, aim, fire. The condemned man would fall. The regiment would be marched past the body, a lesson, a warning. These executions were deeply unpopular among the troops. Soldiers understood that desertion was often a rational response to terrible conditions. They sympathized with the deserters even if they had not deserted themselves. And the executions created resentment. Resentment toward officers, toward the military justice system, toward commanders who ordered men shot for wanting to go home. That resentment in some cases turned into violence. The aftermath, Bragg's continued command. After the bombing attempt, Braxton Bragg continued to command the Army of Tennessee for 8 more months. He fought at Chickamauga in September of 1863, winning one of the Confederacy's last major victories. But he failed to pursue the defeated Union Army, allowing them to retreat to Chattanooga. He besieged Chattanooga but was decisively defeated in November of 1863 at the Battle of Chattanooga. The defeat was catastrophic. The Army of Tennessee was routed. Finally, in December of 1863, Jefferson Davis relieved Bragg of command, not because of the bombing attempt, not because his soldiers hated him, but because he had finally lost one battle too many. Bragg spent the rest of the war in advisory roles. He survived the war and lived until 1876. He died of a stroke in Galveston, Texas. The man who had nearly been killed by his own soldiers lived longer than most of the generals who fought in the Civil War. But his legacy is one of failure. He is remembered as one of the worst generals of the war, a man who could not inspire loyalty, a man who could not win battles when it mattered, a man whose own soldiers tried to kill him. Reflection: the breakdown of discipline. Friends, the story of Braxton Bragg and the bomb raises uncomfortable questions about the Civil War. We want to believe in a war where soldiers followed their officers loyally, where men fought for their cause with devotion, where the enemy was across the battlefield not sleeping in the headquarters tent, but the reality was messier. The Civil War saw massive desertions, mutinies, soldiers refusing to fight, officers shot by their own men. This was not unique to the Civil War. Every war sees some breakdown of discipline. But the Civil War, with its volunteer armies, its citizen soldiers, its lack of professional military culture, saw it more than most. Men joined the army thinking war would be glorious. They found it was hell. They discovered their officers were often incompetent. They watched friends die for no gain. They received letters from home begging them to return, and some of them broke. Some deserted, some turned violent. The bombing attempt on Bragg was the most dramatic example. But there were countless smaller acts of defiance. Soldiers refusing orders, officers being accidentally shot in battle, men simply walking away. The Civil War was not just North versus South, it was also soldier versus officer, enlisted versus commander, those who fought versus those who gave the orders. As we close today, I want you to picture that bedroom in Tullahoma one more time. March 1863, Braxton Bragg sleeping beneath his bed, an artillery shell ticking, waiting. Someone had placed it there. Someone who had decided that murder was preferable to continued service under Bragg's command. That person was never caught. We do not know if it was a deserter who returned, or a soldier still in the ranks, or even an officer who had reached his breaking point. But we know this: Bragg had made so many enemies, created so much resentment, that someone was willing to commit murder. The bomb did not explode. Bragg lived, and the Army of Tennessee continued to suffer under his command for 8 more months. But the message was clear. Loyalty in the Civil War was not guaranteed. Soldiers would not follow bad officers blindly, and when pushed far enough, some would fight back. The deserter who came back to kill his commander, or the soldier who never left but plotted murder anyway, remains anonymous. But his attempt reminds us that the Civil War was not just a conflict between North and South. Sometimes the greatest conflict was between soldiers and the men who commanded them. Friends, if this story made you think, please share it. These darker aspects of the Civil War deserve to be understood. And tell me in the comments, had you heard about the attempt on Bragg's life before? What do you think drove someone to such desperation? I read every comment and I love learning from you. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, keep their memory alive.